Hi, welcome to Hold Up with a Vengeance. I'm Elijah Mulder. My partner Merrick Davis will continue the presentation after I've finished. The title of our paper is Hold Up with a Vengeance, as you may be able to tell from the title of our presentation. In the next slide, we'll talk about the authors. Here we have the authors of Hold Up with a Vengeance. First off, we have Martin Duesenberg. He holds a PhD in economics. He is from Uppsala University. We also have Alex Smith, also holding a PhD in economics from the University of Arizona. And then finally, we have Matt Van Essen, also holding a PhD in economics and also from the University of Arizona. All of our authors are economists whose research focuses on behavioral economics and, in particular, game theory. And they're all obviously experts in their fields. In related literature to Hold Up with a Vengeance, we have the same one of our authors, Dr. Duesenberg, and Dr. Kirchsteiger's Reciprocity and Wage Undercutting. In this paper, the authors make a case for considering reciprocity, both positive and negative, in games in general. This is based on the psychological process that perceived kindness and unkindness will be returned or reciprocated. This article acts as the base for critiques to payoff formulas made by the authors of Hold Up with a Vengeance. In other related literature, we have Guth and Yaris, an evolutionary approach to explain reciprocal behavior in a simple strategic game. Title's a mouthful. The authors propose that there may be a genetic disposition in some people that make them engage in costly revenge. In evolutionary situations, the paper explained, this may decrease competition as a person with these genes may pose a larger threat. In decreasing competition, you increase chances of producing more offspring and thus increasing evolutionary fitness. Both good things in evolution, as I'm sure we all understand. Of our title, Hold Up with a Vengeance, you may be wondering, what is hold up? I'll tell you. Hold up is a situation that occurs when a firm, firm 1, uniquely develops a product for another firm, firm 2. In this situation, firm 1 cannot resell this product to another firm since it only has value to firm 2, giving firm 2 the ability to hold up firm 1, or in other words, demand they pay a lower price than originally agreed upon by the two firms. Not very kind. In standard hold-up situations, this can be prevented by the use of legally enforceable contracts, a desire to maintain reputation, collateral provided by firm 2 before firm 1 commits, competition between firm 2 and another buyer, or through repeated interactions. So say you're going to be doing business with somebody a lot, and you're not going to try to renegotiate a price that you committed to pay because you don't want to screw them over and have that be the precedent for future negotiations and such. Now that we've kind of explained what holdup is, we'd like to explain what a holdup model looks like. So a holdup model, there will be two players trading an investment good. The players will have separate values for the said good, value 1 for player 1 and value 2 for player 2. For a holdup model to function, there are these assumptions. There must be an implicit contract with mutually agreed upon price, P, with cost to produce, C. There will be an investment, and it will be observable to both 1 and 2, but not verifiable. And the value to player 1 is equal to 0. So they don't value the investment good whatsoever. It is simply a means to make a profit. Now then, for the hold-up model to start off, player 1 will choose if they want to invest. If they don't want to invest, the game ends. If they do want to invest, the game continues, and we get to see what player 2 is going to do. Player 2 will decide whether or not to honor the implicit contract. If they choose yes, player 1 receives a payoff of P minus C, the price minus the cost, and player 2 receives a payoff of the value to player 2 minus the price. If player 2 chooses no, player 2 will make a take it or leave it offer with the new price being T, and player 1 may accept or reject. If player 1 accepts this new offer, they receive the new price, T minus the cost, C, and player 2 receives the value to player 2 minus the new price. If player 1 rejects, their payoff is negative C, so negative whatever it costs them to make it, and player two's payoff, is 1 minus A times value player 2, where A is equal to player 1's residual control over the investment. It's important to note that if player 1's residual control over the investment is equal to 0, this will mean that player 2 has total control over the good. So player 2 has already received the good, and it's now just trying to renegotiate. And I believe Merrick will address that later. Here, I'll give a brief synopsis of Hold Up with a Vengeance, just in case you don't have the time to read the whole paper and you still want to know a little bit more about it. Hold Up with a Vengeance offers an additional method to preventing holdup, negative reciprocity, also called vengeance. Vengeance in holdup scenarios is defined as firm 1, the producer, striking back at firm 2, the buyer, after firm 2 tries to hold up firm 1. To model this in the paper, the authors applied a Duesenberg and Kirchsteiger critique to allow the payoff of games to include reciprocity payoff in addition to actual material payoff. They then conducted an experiment which showed that negative reciprocity can prevent holdup in games where the investing firm 1, maintains residual rights of control over the product. So, such as a painter still having the painting, so then they can execute vengeance upon the painting if the painting is, say, of player 2. Here we have the Duesenberg and Kirchsteiger critique, as previously mentioned on the last slide, where vengeance is equal to V, which equals pi plus the sum of theta times kappa times lambda, where pi is player I's actual material payoff, theta is player I's sensitivity to reciprocity, kappa is player I's kindness to player J, and lambda is player I's perception of player J's kindness. The original version of the Duesenberg and Kirchsteiger critique included both positive and negative reciprocity. In Hold Up with a Vengeance, they wanted to focus on negative reciprocity, and they argued that positive reciprocity is a factor amongst other psychological issues, such as guilt. To make this article's model more tractable, they focus on negative reciprocity instead of including the numerous other factors.
Hello everybody, I'm Merrick, and I'm going to be covering the second half of Elijah and I's presentation on Hold Up with a Vengeance. So Elijah just finished covering the conceptual ideas behind Hold Up and behind Vengeance and how vengeance may be relevant in Hold Up scenarios. He also just finished covering two pieces of relevant literature on one that addressed an evolutionary basis for incorporating reciprocity into economic scenarios, and the other, which was the Duesenberg and Kirchsteiger article on reciprocity and wage cutting, which proposed the actual payoff critique that Elijah just finished covering in the previous slide. What I'm going to be doing for these next two slides is covering two real-world scenarios where Hold Up and Vengeance may be relevant. This first one is called the low game. This first scenario is called the low game. That involves two players, the artist and the buyer. In this situation, the buyer asks an artist to make a painting of themselves, of the buyer, and the artist can accept or reject this offer. The reason that this is a hold-up scenario is because the artist is making a painting of the buyer, and we're assuming that the buyer isn't anybody famous, so they're the only one that would value this painting. They're the only one that would be willing to purchase a painting from the artist. In the case where the artist accepts this offer, they're going to invest $2,000 into making the painting. Now, this can be opportunity cost, this can be material cost. It's not specifically stated, but nonetheless, they invest $2,000 total. They may initially attempt to mitigate holdup by constructing a contract which states that the buyer must pay $5,000 despite their true value being $8,000. But this is where the contracts may fall short in mitigating holdup. Because art is a subjective product, the buyer can then claim that the art doesn't meet their standard, that it's ugly, that it's insufficient, and that it therefore violates the terms of the contract. And by doing that, the buyer then can attempt to renegotiate a lower price of $1,000. So you'll notice that $1,000 is lower than the total time and effort and monetary cost that the artist put into the painting, which was $2,000. Now, in the case where the buyer attempts to renegotiate a lower price, they may then anger the artist and then provoke the artist to behave with vengeance. Now, vengeance in this case can take the form of defacing the art, or even finding another buyer that will be willing to purchase it at a much lower price, because again, nobody else is going to really value this painting at the same level as the buyer. But either way, in proposing a lower price, the buyer is then risking angering the artist, who then may retaliate in such a way. If the buyer foresees this retaliation or this negative reciprocity, then they may choose not to renegotiate the price and just agree to the original contract of $5,000 for the painting. In the scenario where they both agree, because the buyer foresees vengeance if they attempt to negotiate down the price, we then arrive at what we'll call the vengeance equilibrium, which is where we arrive at an improved outcome, not because of the contract or any of other terms, but because of the actual threat that vengeance poses to the buyer. So on this slide, we're going to be covering the high game as opposed to the low game on the previous slide. In the high game, we have a professor and we have a student, and the student asks the professor to teach them game theory so that they can make a lot of money. In this case, the professor can agree or disagree, just like the artist in the previous example. And if the professor agrees, then they will spend $2,000 of their time teaching the student, and they will form a contract with the student that says the student will pay $5,000 for this education. The student, in this case, just like the buyer in the previous case, has a private value of $8,000. But they can say that the education they received, again, because this product, similar to the art in the previous example, is subjective, they can say that the education they received was insufficient, and that they can only make a moderate amount of money as opposed to a lot of money that they asked the professor for. So in that case, the student will then attempt to negotiate down the price to $1,000, and when they negotiate down to $1,000, you'll notice the difference here is that the professor cannot retaliate in any way like the artist could in the previous example. The primary difference here is that in the previous example, in the low game, the artist retains residual rights of control over the product, meaning the painting was still in the artist's possession, and they have control over what happens to the product. Therefore, they have the ability to retaliate against the product. Whereas in this example, the professor does not have residual rights of control over a student's education. They can't go into their brain and remove the information they conveyed. The student has that information, and they can't change that the student has that information now. That's the difference where in the high game, vengeance can't improve the outcome, but in the low game, vengeance can improve the outcome, because in the low game, the person who is asked to produce the product retains residual rights of control. So on this slide, we're going to be covering the actual experiment structure that they used to prove that Hold Up and Vengeance was relevant in real-world scenarios and not just hypothetical game scenarios like the previous two I just described. For the actual experiment, they used subjects that were undergraduate students at the University of Arizona. And for each of the 5 sessions they conducted, they had 12 subjects, with 6 being assigned to a high game. Again, this is where a producer does not retain residual rights of control, and the other 6 being assigned to a low game, where the producer does retain residual rights of control. At every session, each of the 6 players per group would complete 5 rounds, being matched anonymously with another player every time. And all of the games that they conducted followed the hold-up format, very similar to the games I just described, the high game and the low game, that we know is typical. That's where the producer makes a product that is specialized for the consumer in the scenario. So these are the actual game trees that are relevant to the experiment that was conducted. You'll notice that we have a game tree, two game trees, one for the high game and one for the low game. And what's important to note here is that player one in both scenarios is the producer, and player two in both scenarios is the consumer. That means player two, it's assumed that player two makes the original proposition, asking player one to produce something specifically for them. Player one can then choose out or in, which is the first move of both of these games, and player two can then choose A or B. In the case where they choose B, then player two is agreeing to the original terms of the contract. In the high and low game scenarios, this is where player two, which was the buyer or the student in those scenarios, would be agreeing to pay the $5,000 for the service that was rendered. Player two could, instead of B, choose A, which is where they attempt to negotiate down the price. To a lower price, which was $1,000 in the previously described high and low game. Player one in both scenarios then has the choice of X or Y, and this is where the high game and the low game differentiate. If player one in this case chooses X, in the high game, this means they're accepting the renegotiation, and they get a payoff of 1, and player two gets a payoff of 9 because they have to then pay player one. In the high game, again, where player one chooses Y instead, they're not agreeing to the renegotiation. But because they have no means of reducing the other player's payoff, player two, this is the best outcome for player two because they get a payoff of 10, and player one doesn't get anything because they cannot retaliate in any way. Now, that's where, in the low game, that's different because if they choose X, where they would then, it would be the same thing as choosing X in the high game. If you choose X in the low game, you're agreeing to the renegotiation. But if you choose Y instead, in the low game, this is where the producer maintains residual rights of control, such as the painting. They can choose to deface the painting and therefore decrease player two's overall payoff from 10 in the high game to 2 now in the low game when they choose outcome Y instead. So here we have the results of the experiment, and really the only two tables that are going to be relevant here are table 1 and table 2. In table 2, you'll notice that this is at the second node, I believe, of the game, where player 2 can select A or B, where B is choosing to agree to the original contract. And you'll notice that in the low game, where player 2 may fear player 1 committing vengeance, they choose B more often. They go with the contract more often than they do in the high game. And a similar belief in vengeance is indicated in table 1, where we show that Y is selected more in the low game than it is in the high game. Again, where Y is player 1 is ignoring the higher payoff they would get by selecting X and choosing instead to commit vengeance, getting no payoff, but ensuring that player 2 gets a lower payoff in the low game, whereas in the high game, it doesn't actually impact player 2's payoff to select Y. So the experiments did show that the assumptions of the previously described high game and low game were accurate, and that vengeance can prevent holdup in scenarios where the producer maintains residual rights of control, which confirms the research hypothesis, which was the mean percentage of Y choices is higher in the low game than in the high game, which is to say that in the low game, more often player 1 will commit vengeance than they do in the high game, which is counterintuitive to the standard game theory subgame outcome, which would indicate that player 1 would instead select option X because they get a higher payoff. But that's not the case because they're committing vengeance instead, which then ensures that more often they select option B, that player 2 selects option B in the low game. Now, there were a certain fraction of players that did not have this behavior, and we can explain that away with other traits such as altruism, anxiety, positive reciprocity, and lack of foresight. And again, the D&K critique did initially include positive reciprocity, but they argued that this overall would become less tractable if they addressed positive reciprocity, and also overall had a less impact than negative reciprocity would in these scenarios specifically. So the overall contribution of this work is that it offered a different way to reach an improved outcome in holdup scenarios. Whereas in all other scenarios, we would have to, in all other cases, in holdup games, you'd have to rely on a third party or a third party factor or external factor like legal recourse, putting up collateral, or the presence of third-party competition, which then would violate the idea of a hold-up game, or the use of third-party mediators that would ensure a better outcome. In this case, you're not relying on any of those external factors. Instead, you're just relying on the actual traits of the players. If one of the players is willing to, if the producer is willing to get vengeance and they have the ability to get vengeance, that can then help the players arrive at an improved outcome, as we saw in the results of the experiment. So the previously described experiment showed that we can rely on psychological processes as opposed to third-party factors to prevent holdup scenarios. In this case, the psychological process is, of course, vengeance, and vengeance serves to help the seller arrive at a better outcome for themselves and arrive at equilibrium. On a policy or aggregate level, holdup is already less common than it is on an individual or microeconomic basis, and the results of this experiment may show why that is. Vengeance or vengeful tactics or more aggressive business strategies that are prone to vengeance are more common on an aggregate level or policy level than they are on a smaller individual level. In fact, Donald Trump is described in this article as encouraging the use of aggressive business strategies and vengeance in big business, whereas that may be less common on an individual case-by-case basis. So this, the results of the experiment overall imply a reason why the aggregate levels of holdup are lower than individual levels of holdup are. And these are the sources that we used for the presentation. At the top, we have the article itself, Hold Up with a Vengeance. But yeah, that concludes this presentation, and thank you guys for watching.